Hi, welcome to Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 3 podcast. I am Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I am an economist, a military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. So welcome to the podcast and thank you for joining. If you like my content and you want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. So this week we'll just go over wrote 3 articles this week, 4th if you consider a small Easter message I did. So the 3 articles we did this week, or that I wrote this week, was the Moscow blame messaging, North Korean two-step, and China and Philippines strategies to frustrate each other. So first of all, let's talk about the Moscow blame messaging. I wrote a similar article the prior week that covered some of this. It was the Moscow blame game is more of a updated version. And one thing that definitely came out of this particular week is the Russians are blaming the Ukrainians and the United States, and they're sticking to that story. There was an initial response when the attack first happened that on March 22nd, there was Moscow police were blaming the Ukrainians, and then as the week went on, they still stuck to the story of blaming the Ukrainians, again with no proof. Most of this coming from the members of the Duma, some of the more hardcore supporters of Putin himself, and but this week they added the director of the FSB, Alexander Bortnikov, blamed the Ukraine for the terrorist attack, despite ISIS-K taking the credit, and the U.S. and the French warning them. This time around, though, they added that U.S. and the U.K., United Kingdom's intelligence services were involved. So one thing we run, FSB is the Federal Security Service. It is what took over most of the tasks of the old Soviet KGB. So the FSB takes responsibility for internal security within Russia, among other tasks. So the Alexander Bortnikov, the director, him following Putin's message, take that for what it's worth, if it's just him just supporting the government or if he's also following the same line of thinking as the president of Russia. So they blamed Ukraine and U.S. and United Kingdom intelligence for the attack. One of the things that they look into is some of the logic that was used is circumstantial logic. The Chechens during the late 1990s and early 2000s was in a war of independence and a rebellion against Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the Chechens had the biggest terrorist attack in Russia. It was roughly the one that's the most deadly attack prior to this one on March 22nd. But the Chechens were commonly performed terrorist attacks on Russian targets, including school kids and non-combatants, which is, again, typical for terrorism. So some of the logic was, well, if the Chechens, a smaller power, did this to Russia, a greater power, then the Ukrainians are just as capable of doing this, also being a former Soviet republic, being a smaller power compared to Russia. If the Chechens did it, then obviously it's something that's not within the something that can be ignored, that the Ukrainians would not do the same thing. So again, circumstantial logic. The other one is terrorist attacks require money. So even if ISIS-K, and this is a point that the FSB director was making, that even if ISIS-K did the attack, who funded the attack? So that comes into the question is, yeah, maybe it was ISIS-K, but was it something that was funded and set up by the Ukrainian and the Western intelligence services? So again, he's bringing up that logic in his argument. And then the other one is the attackers were arrested. The 4 gunmen were captured along with, I think, in the end, 8 others, 7 immediately. Another one was added later. The attackers were on their way to Ukraine, according to the Russians. Now, obviously, when you look at the map, Ukraine Moscow is north of Ukraine, And also, we'll cover this momentarily, is most of these terrorists were from Tajikistan, which is a former Soviet republic in Asia. So if you are going, trying to escape Moscow, chances are you're going to go to the south, especially if you're from Asia. Well, south of Moscow is Ukraine, also southern parts of Russia, and then eventually the gateway to Asia. So just because they're moving south, somehow that makes them heading to Ukraine. Now, the logic could be that Ukraine set up the terrorist attack so Ukraine was a safe haven for the terrorists to go, because obviously the Russian authorities would not be able to take police action within the borders of Ukraine. So that's some of the logic that they came up with. They presented no hard evidence to this effect. In all fairness to the director of the FSB, you would not see the U.S. intelligence service presenting any evidence either. Not saying that I support the FSB's position on this. So defending Ukraine being the one, Ukraine has come up and denied it. They had nothing to do with this attack, and that's coming from the Ukrainian side, and that's been pretty consistent. And you could see that the Ukrainians would probably not want to take credit for it, but that doesn't imply guilt either. So the Belarus dictator, which is a staunch ally of Vladimir Putin, his name's Alexander Lukashenko, stated the terrorists were traveling to Ukraine border because they knew Belarus border was too secure. So in that logic, if they're heading to Ukraine, why would the security of the Belarus border really matter? So that seems like, again, Belarus is a separate country of Russia, but obviously he's trying to support Putin, but he's coming up with a different logic that actually negates much of the logic coming from the Alexander Bortnikov. So the other one is that the terrorists were, as I mentioned earlier, were largely from Tajikistan. And again, they could have been fleeing back to the Asian parts of the former Soviet Republic or to Tajikistan itself. So again, if you're going to attack Moscow and you flee south, yes, you could run into Ukraine, but you're also heading back to the easiest gateway back to Asia. And again, Tajikistan is south in the southern Asian republics of the former Soviet Union. So, and just to be clear, Tajikistan was a former Soviet republic, but it is an independent country now. Other thing it goes into is ISIS-K, which is the one who took the credit for the attack, and also the ones that both the U.S. and the French intelligence services and State Department for the U.S. warned the Russians that there was a danger of an attack. Well, ISIS-K is the one who took credit for it. ISIS-K is a Sunni terror organization, and in this case, Russia has aligned itself with the anti-Sunni Shia Iranians and the Syrians. So the Russians are, in the eyes of the Sunni organizations, mainly ISIS-K and Islamic State, is an enemy of the Islamic, of ISIS-K and the Islamic State. So, excuse me if you can hear a train horn right now. So, the other part is that ISIS-K operates out of Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan and Tajikistan have a common border with Afghanistan, so it would be easy for ISIS-K members to come into Tajikistan, or Tajikistan citizens going to receiving training from ISIS-K in Afghanistan. So the Tajikistan citizens have been recruited for prior terrorist campaigns in the past. I think they've been credited for 10 international terrorist attacks in the world. Also, for getting into Russia, Tajikistan citizens are allowed a travel visa, are allowed to travel visa-free in Russia for up to 90 days. So it's relatively easy for Tajikistan citizens trained by ISIS-K to sneak into Russia, because again, they don't need a visa to do that. And then also is I talked about this in the previous week's paper. Ukraine has more to lose than to gain from terrorism. The West has been victims of terrorism, obviously 9/11, the London bus bombings. I think it was Nice, France, with the truck running over many French citizens and killing many of them, dozens of them. So the West has been a victim of a terrorist attack in the past, and it is unlikely that even if the West, for the most part, still supports Ukraine, that they would support Ukraine doing terrorist attacks against citizens of another country or of Russia, even though Russia is, again, enemy of Ukraine, and the West is leery of, suspicious of Russia and their intentions, rightfully so. It is doubtful that support would be granted to Ukraine, which is, at this point, as long as the war's been going in its third year, some of that support is pretty soft, and it doesn't garner well for Ukraine to do a terrorist attack like this. This week, we've seen them using drone attacks in Russia, obviously much more effective and much more of a Ukrainian style of warfare than choosing to do terrorist attacks. So again, covered that last week. But again, Ukraine has a lot to lose. They have a lot of Western support, which again, they're economically and militarily reliant on the West to fight this war with Russia. And they would not want to lose that public support by doing a terrorist campaign against a non-military target. The other one that comes up to is go in there is the FSB is overstretched. Again, it is responsible for internal security. And during this war with Ukraine, there have been protests and there's been internal dissent, and the Russians have cracked down on these fairly significantly. But they also have to keep their vigilance up. So many disaffected people in Russia that would normally be quiet, the Russian invasion of Ukraine have given them a cause to protest, and this has meant that the FSB has been to be more active to find these so that they do not, their opinions do not grab hold and start swinging the Russian public's opinion against the war. So again, the FSB has been stretched fairly thin trying to cover all these. And then the other part is there is anti-regime Russians. A lot of them operate out of Ukraine or are supported by Ukraine, and they do cross-border attacks from Ukraine into Russia. Most of those are fought by the military, but the FSB does have a role in this. So again, this is something the war has stretched the capacity of the FSB, so it would be easier for terrorism to sneak into the country when the FSB is focused the other way. The other part about internal security was from March 15th to the 17th was the 3-day presidential election. FSB and the Russian police were expected to secure those elections. So make sure that they went smoothly, make sure there wasn't any terrorist attacks, make sure that they weren't disrupted by protests. And this election was completed 5 days before the attack. So it would be much easier for terrorists to move within Russia, while, again, FSB is focused on the Russian election. The case against Western involvement, so again, Bortnikov has blamed the West or have them playing a role, is, yes, the West's involvement is plausible, but in my opinion, not likely. And I'll go through that here in just a moment. Western funding for an attack could weaken Putin's standing with Russians. So that's something that, there could be a reason for West, mainly United States, United Kingdom, to be motivated to do this. At least, again, the plausibility is there. But it would be the West coordinating an attack within the Russia sphere of influence. Again, Tajikistan, I know that's an independent country, but that's within the Soviet sphere of influence. And there are Russians in those countries. So getting caught, because again, the military service, the intelligence agencies could be fairly active in those areas. The risk of being uncovered after the attack is pretty risky. And if the West gets caught in doing this, you do risk a war with Russia, because again, this would be probably an act of war if a organized state attacks another state through the act of terrorism. So why would the West risk something like this when they're again operating in the Russian backyard? It seems highly unlikely. Again, plausible, but to me, it would be unlikely. And again, it goes back to the ideas. You look here in the U.S., there's obviously President Biden is a supporter of the Ukraine war. There's many in Congress, maybe not quite, or probably just over 50% support in Congress for increase, not just static spending, but increased support to Ukraine. So if the U.S. was involved and got uncovered performing a terrorist attack in Russia, this support in the Congress and the U.S. public would evaporate immediately. So again, long term for the cause of supporting Ukraine, which again is something that many politicians in Washington, D.C. want to do, would be catastrophic to the cause. So again, the risk seems much higher than the potential reward. One thing we'll eventually do is Russia will follow the money, because one of the things that, again, this backs up the story from the Russians and the FSB, is one of the terrorists admitted that he never actually met the people that coordinated the attack. Everything was done through the phone, bank accounts, everything was done through the phone. So the payments. So yes, there's money to be followed, and the Russians will follow this money, and they will find out the cause eventually, but most likely we will never find out what caused this attack. We won't find the true findings from the Russians because the fact is the Russian government cannot be embarrassed. And also blaming the West, Ukraine, for the war or for this attack only supports the Russians' support for the war. So Russians might question the war if it comes out and says that because of the Russian war, the FSB was focused somewhere else and they allowed a terrorist attack to happen, is much different than them coming back, the government's official line, saying the Ukrainians did this, so we need to continue our war in Ukraine. So the next paper that I did, that hopefully we all read here, was the North Korean two-step. Again, Kim Jong-un we'll just call him a character, and he seems like he loves his attention. If people stop paying attention to him, he has to do something to get attention. So, this is another case of the Ukraine war. This was demonstrating how the Ukraine war and the reaction to it has eroded the world order. And even on topics that the West and Russia could agree, like nuclear proliferation, now are up in the air, as the support for the war, whether you're siding on one side or the other, will determine what the policies are going to be followed. So last week, the U.S. and South Korea held their first meeting in what's called the Enhanced Disruption Task Force, EDTF, with the goal of monitoring sanctions against North Korea for their nuclear weapons and missile programs, which again, all these are sanctioned by the UN. The goal was to enforce the sanctions of the sanctions against petroleum and refined petroleum products from getting into North Korea. They were allowed, I think, 500,000 barrels of oil to be sold, and everything out over that is a sanctions violation. And so, actually, I think it's 500,000 barrels of refined petroleum products are over the cap. I'd have to go. I'm not sure the petroleum cap, but it is a pretty significant cap on the amount of energy that's allowed in North Korea. So what this EDTF is doing is it's focusing on looking for companies and individuals who facilitate North Korea and circumventing the sanctions. So what they'll do is they will look at the U.S. and South Korea and their allies will sanction these individuals and companies that are helping support North Korea break the sanctions. So just a couple days later, the same week, again, a couple days later, in the same week, the Russians vetoed the renewal of the UN Security Council resolution to monitor United Nations sanctions against North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. So this basically negated the EDTF, or at least make it much harder for them to work. So we have one side of the coin earlier that week. This new Enhanced Disruption Task Force starts up to look at sanctioning companies and individuals helping North Korea circumvent the sanctions. And then 3 days later, the Russians veto the UN sanctions, the task force that's responsible for monitoring UN sanctions against North Korea. So again, the work of the EDTF was negated by a Russian veto. So what happened is, I think 15 members on the UN Security Council, 13 were for the continued sanctions monitoring, 1 abstained, China, and Russia vetoed. China obviously wants to support Russia, but they also want to look, as I like to call them, the reasonable, unreasonable country. So they didn't have to do anything. They didn't have to vote against it, or they didn't have to veto it because the Russians already did it. So their 2 vetoes do not do any good. All it takes is 1 veto from a permanent member. So the Chinese took the cowardly way out and sat on the sidelines instead of taking a stand one way or another. But I understand why they did it, because just that's the way the UN and their rules are set up. So this is a case where, again, the talking about the breakdown of the world order, is the Russians used to be a supporter of this UN monitoring board, because the Russians were as much you could say about the Russians and the Soviets before them, they were in the last few decades, or many decades, probably since the helping of the Chinese get the nuclear weapon, have been a non-proliferation country. They have been pretty adamant about not sharing nuclear technology to help other countries make nuclear weapons. Yes, they do help with building nuclear reactors, and some of the nuclear reactors can be questionably breeder-type reactors, which help create plutonium, if I understand my physics correctly. But they have not been a supporter of spreading nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology across the world. So the Russians, who are also under sanctions due to the war in Ukraine, not by the UN, because obviously any UN sanction can be vetoed by the Russians because they are a permanent member of this UN Security Council. But oftentimes the North Korean program is viewed as something that supports Western policies. And when I say Western policies, that includes countries like Australia, New Zealand, most importantly, Japan and South Korea are the 2 countries that are most impacted by North Korean's nuclear program. But I conclude them in the West because obviously they're Western-aligned countries. So the Russians have no particular interest in supporting Russia or the West in their efforts against North Korea, and there's a couple reasons for that. It's about the world splitting into camps, very similar to the Cold War over the Ukraine war. The Russians need, because of the sanctions by the world, mainly the European Union, the West, and their leveraging into the banking and insurance sectors, have, I say insurance sectors because oil that's being transported on ships has to be insured. Like all ships carrying cargo have to be insured. So the Russians, because of these sanctions, they're not completely cut from selling their oil, but they have pretty high restrictions and they have high quotas on the amount of oil they can sell. Well, the Russians still are at a war and they need to fund that war, so they need a market to sell their oil. So they are going to countries that are kind of loose in the sanctions regime of oil. Obviously China is, North Korea, obviously, surprisingly India. And so the Russians sell their oil at a discount as a way to get around the sanctions, because as much as, let's say, a country like China wants to, let's say let's say India. India generally doesn't want the war in Ukraine to happen, but their economy is growing, and they're very much interested in the idea of buying discounted oil, regardless of what the Western world seeks. So the other way is the Russians get around. They do a funny way of getting around the sanctions with the North Koreans, is they go offshore and they pump Russian oil. Russian oil is pumped offshore into North Korean ships, and then those North Korean ships go to North Korea and offload their oil. That was kind of a funny way of doing it. I'm not sure if all their oil is done that way. It seems like a highly efficient way, but North Korea is a highly inefficient economy, and so maybe this is just enough to get them by and a way to prevent their for example, ships carrying Russian oil from being seized by Western countries trying to support the sanctions. So that might be a way that they never dock in North Korea, that they can get around the sanctions. So the other part is that we go into the war. So obviously Russia's selling oil. So one of the things that came up in this UN Security Council was this monitoring group. They were actually reporting that the North Koreans were awash in oil, and the oil had to become from Russia. So they were about to present proof they had been presenting proof that the Russians were helping break the sanctions as far as regard to North Korea. Again, what EDTF was signed up. So the Russians just simply gone in there and vetoed it. Now, the other part is that the Russians need, this is kind of funny, they need a market to sell their oil, so North Korea is a market, but Russia also needs, because of its war and it's trying to ramp up to war production, it needs artillery shells, ammunition, and it also needs missiles. So Russia entered into an agreement with the North Koreans to get North Korean arms and missiles to help support the war in Ukraine. You've seen various estimates of about 1 million artillery rounds sent to Russia. The South Korea and the United States say there were 10,000 containers delivered to Russia from North Korea. North Korea and Russia actually do have a small land border where they can pass through, ship overland containers without having to go through sea, so they don't risk interdiction from navies or coast guards trying to enforce the UN sanctions. So the offshoot of this is that they've said that there's been reports. And again, this is probably Ukrainian, but I could see it because North Korea is not known for high-end equipment. They said that they do have some issues with the fuses being either too long or too short. So what's happening is when they fire a round and it's too short, they're actually they set it to go fire, let's say, a mile, and it ends up only going 3/4 of a mile because the charges inside the rounds are too short or too long. So they fire long or fire short. So again, not a lot of quality control. Thought that was a odd story. It's not exactly a selling point for North Korean ammunition. So the question, the open question is, nobody really knows, what is North Korea getting in exchange for the agreement to sell Russia these missiles and all these artillery rounds. So it's not confirmed, but it's suspected that the Russians are providing technical assistance to North Korea. Since the agreement to sell ammunition or transfer ammunition from North Korean stockpiles to Russia, North Korea has successfully launched a spy satellite. So that raised a lot of questions. They had failed in the past. So organically, did they finally succeed, or did the Russians give them some technical assistance to finally reach orbit? Also, is North Korea has recently introduced, I think roughly 2 weeks ago, maybe a little bit longer as far as maybe 2 weeks ago when it made the press, introduced a solid rocket motor. So, so the question is Russia facilitating these technologies? The reason why solid rocket fuel is a big improvement over liquid fueled is that if you're talking about for military applications, it takes time to fuel a liquid rocket, whether it has to be fueled prior to launch. Obviously, it has to be fueled prior to launch, but does it have to be emptied in storage and then has to be fueled prior to launch? Also, liquid fuel rockets do have to have their propellants changed from time to time if they're not in the case where they have to be fueled just prior to launch. So these are all things that have to happen, and it takes your rocket forces either a certain amount have to be offline while they're being fuel being taken out, new fuel being put back in, or if they have to be fueled just prior to launch. Spy satellites in the West, South Korean intelligence is going to, and Japanese are going to find these out. And so you are less likely to be able to launch a surprise attack. That's completely different with solid fuel rockets, because once the solid fuel's there, it doesn't need the maintenance and the defueling. It is just ready to go. So that is a case where we go in there and say, as a first strike capability of solid rocket fuel motor is a fairly big step forward for the North Koreans. So the question is this something homegrown, or did they receive additional Russian support to be able to create this engine? The other part is that Russia can, in its war, it can help facilitate the selling of North Korean missiles and missile technology, because again, it's by moving the missiles overland in Russia, they can't be interdicted. So the Russians can help sell forbidden technology parts either for themselves or they can sell it to other countries. Let's say for Pakistan, Iran, who need maybe are interested in acquiring new missile technology. So the Russians, who have both favorable relations with Iran and Syria, but also could work through an intermediary in China to sell parts to Pakistan. So again, this is all theoretical, but again, if the Russians can move missile technology across its border, it cannot be interdicted by the West. So that's just another way to help North Koreans gain money and get around sanctions, is using the Russian war in Ukraine. The other aspect of it, and it's not covered a lot, but it's not a original thought by myself, is North Korea has relied on its artillery as the backbone of its military. They always talked about they could fire 1 million rounds into Seoul, the South Korean capital, which is relatively close to the South Korean border, the DMZ, demilitarized zone. And they said that they could turn Seoul into, North Koreans said they can turn Seoul into a sea of fire, firing up to 1 million rounds within a day and destroy large parts of Seoul, killing, it depends if it's a surprise attack or if it's a planned attack, about the number of but they expect large quantities of civilians to be wounded and killed in an attack of such. So North Korea highly reliant on their artillery arm, but now they're shipping large quantities of their artillery ammunition to Russia. And it's not because they're having a friendly, peaceful relations with South Korea. These two countries have really stepped things up against each other, mainly started prior to the North Korean launch of a spy satellite. The South Koreans turned around and launched a spy satellite of their own on a SpaceX rocket. So ever since that happened, the relations have really gone downhill. And at this point, the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un, has said that no, they are not going to seek any type of reunification of the peoples of Korea, and that they are the sworn enemies. So you're seeing manning outposts back on the DMZ. You're starting to see much more bellicose rhetoric coming across the border on both sides. So again, North Korea is selling large amounts of artillery ammunition to the Russians, a large amount of missiles to the Russians. Does this represent that the North Koreans are switching their war doctrine from one of using large amounts of artillery to relying on their nuclear weapons, either through a first strike using, again, solid rocket motors for a surprise attack, or something or some mixed doctrine in effect, but not relying wholly on their artillery. Also, interestingly enough, which is kind of a red flag, is the North Koreans. Again, I know they're big into rhetoric that's often not backed by anything, or is just rhetoric for the sake of rhetoric. Is they've renounced their policy of no first nuclear use. So they're opening themselves, or they basically have stated that they would be willing to use a preemptive strike or a surprise attack using nuclear weapons against their sworn enemies of South Korea, Japan, and the United States. So is this more rhetoric for North Korea, or has there been a real shift in North Korean doctrine? It really does make you wonder, is that they're talking about getting ready for war at the same time they're shipping large amounts of their ammunition, artillery ammunition, the backbone of their military, of their armed forces, to the Russians. So, again, North Korea is not a big industrial powerhouse. It can't rely on receiving shipments from other countries. So to make up selling over 1 million rounds of artillery to the Russians, that's not a stockpile they're going to be easily able to make up. The Russians are, again, stepping up to war footing, but they're going to have a war of their own. And so they got to make this artillery for themselves. So they're not going to be able to restock North Korean stockpiles. Are the Chinese? That is questionable too. The Chinese are pretty active right now. They're looking over there at Taiwan. And we'll talk about it coming up. They've got their hands full with the Philippines. So there's more to come. North Korea is always a interesting area to look to see if you get nostalgic for Stalinist type policies. That's always the place to go. So more to come. It'd be interesting to see what's going to happen with that nuclear doctrine, and if they are truly shifting to something that's other than an artillery-based military response, which again, now that they have nuclear weapons, makes you wonder, and then with that unknown support from the Russians. So the other one, the final article, was China and Philippines strategy for frustrating each other. Now, they continued the South China Sea and the Second Thomas Shoal. You're starting to see continued sparring between the Chinese and the Philippines, using the Chinese Coast Guard and the maritime militia against the Chinese or the Philippine Navy, Coast Guard, and resupply ships to the Second Thomas Shoal. No incidents last week, but as far as no more water cannon shooting, no more lasers pointing at crews of the Philippine ships, no ramming, nothing like that this week. But it was more of a trading barbs and accusations with each other. Now, what it comes into is the idea is what the 9-dash line. And this is where the Chinese claim nearly the entire South China Sea. And they basically dismiss anybody that protests the Chinese claims. China completely dismisses them, that they are saying that this is their historic claim and this is their sovereign territory. The 9-dash line is when you pull a map out, it extends into the South China Sea. They put a line along island chains and rock formations, reefs, that there's 9 of them. That's why they call 9 dashes, because they wrote the line along the length of those rock or island chains to come up with the 9-dash line. Taiwan calls it 11-dash line because they add in some areas of the Taiwanese that claim as well. So that's what the 9-dash line comes in. And so the Chinese say that's their sovereign territory, and this is their territory, and anybody that passes through there without the Chinese permission is trespassing. And this is an important strategic waterway for the world because 60% of all commerce travels through the South China Sea from China, obviously a huge player in the import-export market. But then you still have North Korea. You have Japanese ships going to the south. And then you have naval powers like the U.S. Predominantly, but you also have the U.K., which traditionally look at freedom of navigation and freedom of the seas, and so they don't recognize those claims. So this is a pretty significant area of international issues, but when you're running into with it is that the Philippines are not backing down, and they're choosing a strategy that actually is most disruptive to the Chinese. So the one thing the Chinese do is they prefer a strategy of insisting that that they insist on compliance. You are expected as a country to comply to them. That you have to acknowledge their claims first, and acknowledge compliance, and that if you have a dispute that you would like to discuss further, which again in the Chinese view is this is non-negotiable. It's kind of weird, but they say, okay, you can negotiate it with us as soon as you admit your that Chinese have are basically the Chinese are right. That's according to the Chinese, and that these disputes need to be through bilateral negotiations. Now, if you're a large country like China, and China is the largest country in that region, Japan is obviously significant, Australia, New Zealand, and of course the United States, working with conjunction with Japan and the Philippines and Australia and New Zealand, is also a big power, but it's not the actual power in the area, but it is a big regional power, obviously. U.S. Navy projects force throughout that area. So any of the small countries are at a complete disadvantage when dealing with China. China's got a much bigger military. They've got a much bigger economy. They can threaten a smaller country. So what's going to happen is that these countries can't match the Chinese military threat. They can't compete with the economic impact if China decides to punish these small countries. So these countries tend to not want to protest China and will just basically ignore the claim. Or they will just do something to just not even say anything to China at all because they don't want China's ire to be raised. So they'd rather just, okay, we'll just let the Chinese claim this area, and maybe they hope they can negotiate some form of fishing rights or something like that, that China will not launch their maritime militia or their Coast Guard and disrupt their commerce in the area. But again, that requires some form of acknowledgement of China's sovereignty in the South China Sea. Well, the Philippines do the exact opposite. And because Philippines is a significant country, but they are still, again, considered a small country, especially when you're talking about the scale of Japan's, the United States, and the China's of the world. They've chosen the opposite. They are ignoring China's claims, and they publicize China's bullying tactics. They pull the press into their ships going into the South China, to the Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea, or they call it the West Philippine Sea. And they actually publicize these pictures. Now you can find lots of pictures now of what's going on the Second Thomas Shoal. China doesn't like these types of displays that everything's put out in the open, because it does make China look bad. They are the aggressive party, and all it's doing is that Philippines are trying to run a supply mission to their outpost in the Second Thomas Shoal. And they are getting rammed, they're getting water cannon, they're getting lasers shot at them, and all this is now being captured by international news media. And then the Philippines will bring other countries into the into alliances to contest China's claims in South China Sea. Now, this is something that China does not like. They are irritated. They do not want any party. They want those bilateral agreements, and they don't want any third, fourth party coming into those negotiations. So they don't want any type of any of these smaller countries forming alliances or bringing other countries into the disputes in the South China Sea. And the Philippines are forming alliances with Japan, the Australia, Vietnam, Brunei. I think they just signed a recent technology upgrade with the Japanese. So obviously they're going to form, and then the U.S. And so the current president of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., has brought up the defense alliance that the Philippines have with the United States. So they're willing to bring the U.S. and other countries into these disputes in the South China Sea, which absolutely irritates China because, again, China only wants bilateral talks with anybody that wants to dispute their claims. So the Philippines are definitely not doing this, and they're bringing everybody in, and they're also going into international court. And again, they've already been twice and won, but China ignores them. But they're also bringing in other Asian economic, we'll just say, I don't want to say clubs, but economic organizations in Asia for Asian countries, and they're bringing up the South China Sea disputes. So again, all these are irritants to China. So the other advantage that they do is, and I talked about this in a prior paper, is China does have aircraft carriers, but they're nascent. They're ones basically an improved Kuznetsov class and another aircraft carrier of a foreign design, I think Russian or Ukrainian design, but they build it on, but it's designed by another country. And now they just built their first aircraft carrier, but it still hasn't even started sea trials from the last I saw. So they don't have a power projection of any significant amount. And the Philippines lays just outside most of the Chinese mainland air cover. So the aircraft carriers will not be able to project force effectively into the Philippines. The Chinese Navy would not be able to operate on the eastern side of the Philippines, be heavily pressed, especially without air cover, and they're flying into the air cover of the Philippines. And if their defense treaty with the U.S. has been activated, they would have to deal with the U.S. aircraft and the U.S. Navy and its carriers and submarines. So this is a war that's geographically is a disadvantage to China. So China can't really threaten a war with the Philippines because this is not a war that China wants, especially why Taiwan is still an independent country, and we go into the first island chain and all that, is China doesn't want a war with the Philippines, and Philippines know that. So they're pressing all China's buttons over the South China Sea and the Second Thomas Shoals. Again, form bilateral agreements, bringing in the press to show off what the Chinese are doing, and knowing that they have a defense alliance with the U.S. and that they are relatively safe from China going into a serious dispute with them or serious war with them over the Second Thomas Shoal, because it's not a war that China wants. And also, if they go up against the U.S. Navy in the Philippines, and the Philippines themselves, and probably going to get Japan dragged into it, the Chinese Navy is going to get mauled. Not saying that Japan and the United States won't be impacted and take casualties as well, but the Chinese Navy is going to be mauled. And China has a definite interest in looking at an invasion of Taiwan. If they get into a fight like that over the Philippines, they will not be able to take Taiwan. It would push them back decade to decades before they could ever revisit the idea of taking Taiwan. So it's not the war that China wants, and the Philippines know that. So China is starting to change tack now, and they are looking at courting the former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, who is a political rival of Ferdinand Marcos Jr. And so the Chinese are starting to court him. They're starting to bring him in what talks about economic development. And the idea is that they're trying to bring a rivalry to Marcos by weakening Marcos's grip inside the Philippines itself. So maybe Marcos would be less willing to have to stand up to China and all the concerns that go with that, and all the bad press that maybe go with it when you have a politician who is fairly popular, probably not as popular as Marcos, but a fairly popular politician whose daughter is also the vice president of Ferdinand Marcos, and the Chinese are courting this person. So it looks like really that the Chinese are trying to take steps to interfere in the Philippine political and public affairs as a way to weaken Marcos's presidency, so that he can't be as focused on continuing to resist Chinese in the second Thomas Shoal. The other part is that China could also have an option, and it looks like this is something that's being considered as well, though there's no set timeline. The Sierra Madre is a World War II U.S. World War II era ship that was traded to, I think it went after World War II, eventually went into the U.S. Reserve Fleet, and I think it went to South Vietnam. After just before the fall, or just after the fall, I think the ship was sold to the Philippines. The Philippines in the 1990s, actually it might have been the late 1990s, early 2000s, grounded the Sierra Madre into the second Thomas Shoal as a way to bolster their claim of the second Thomas Shoal. The ship is old. It's grounded. It can't move. It's rusting away. The Philippines keep about 24 Marines that have to be resupplied and have to be occasionally rotated out. And this is where China really puts up a lot of effort to try to stop those resupply missions. Those resupply missions are becoming harder and harder to do because they have to go through more and more pressure through either the Chinese Coast Guard or the maritime militia. If China's willing to go deal with the bad press, which apparently is coming because the Philippines bring the press aboard on all these events when they decide to make supply runs to the Sierra Madre, the Sierra Madre needs to be repaired. And if the Philippines can't even run supply missions, there's no way they're going to be left alone, meaning the Philippines, to take time to repair that ship, to make it stand up. That ship will most likely collapse, fall apart one day, and the Philippines would have to basically abandon it. And if they abandon it, you're not sure what the Chinese will do, but they will definitely make it. They will probably ensure that there's no return of a Philippines contingent there. It's one thing to try to remove a contingent. It's another thing to just prevent somebody from landing altogether. So it would be the advantage that the Chinese, but they don't know how long it would take. It could collapse. That ship could collapse tomorrow. It could collapse 5 years from now. The Philippines have to find a way to start contesting this strategy with the Chinese. That what's the contingency if they have to abandon the Sierra Madre? What do they do to try to keep the Chinese from making some type of claim of their own on the island as soon as the Philippines have to abandon their outpost there? So this is the challenge for the Philippines, is that they're winning on this, but now that China, or initially they frustrated the Chinese policy, China has evolved their policy to go towards trying to weaken the internal politics of the Philippines and looking at options to keep the Philippines from maintaining that outpost in the long term within at the second Thomas Shoal with the Sierra Madre. The Philippines need to evolve their strategy now to contest China's interference in domestic affairs, but also have a contingency of when when the Sierra Madre will eventually have to be abandoned. So that is today's or this week's review. If you like my work, please consider supporting I'll leave the links, but either become a paid subscriber or a free subscriber to Substack. Both help me. Then the other ones is also, if you care, support me through Patreon for as little as $1 a month. So please, again, thank you for all my subscribers. And again, I ask you to consider becoming a subscriber. Again, you can become free subscriber, but also support would also be greatly appreciated. I will probably go back. I will probably be, or I will be back next week. Some of the areas that I'm probably looking at some of the discussion points is more NATO questions coming up this week. That's just definitely one that will be in next week. The rest is kind of up in the air. So stick with me with, if you read my papers, I try to write them on a fly. I do have other full-time job. So sometimes I miss on the, kind of embarrassing to me, but I do occasionally miss on the grammar. I go back and make corrections. So if you see some of those corrections, again, I apologize for it, and I try my best to come back and make those fixes in the website itself. So just want to go in that. But again, thank you for everybody that's supported me. And if you have any comments, you can comment, and I'll be on the messaging service on Substack, and you can reach me there. I'm also on X under Pegasus Research. I'm also on YouTube, which I just put small snippets to try to bring an audience back over to Substack to read my full work. But I'm also at Pegasus Research on Rumble and Pegasus Research on YouTube. I hope all of you have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye.